Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. Now, it seemed just 24 hours or more ago that the United States and Iran were possibly on the brink of war, especially since the Iranian retaliation, quote-unquote retaliation, I put that in quotation marks, upon U.S. bases in Iraq. That, of course, in retaliation for the assassination of Qasem Soleimani, an Iranian commander, as well as, of course, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was also the commander of an Iraqi militia force backed by the Islamic Republic of Iran. It seems, though, now that both countries have reached seemingly an understanding that things will not escalate further from here. Donald Trump's statement, which was meant to come right after, in fact, that attack by the Iranians had taken place and then was delayed. And then we had Donald Trump, as you well know, read out that very scripted statement. He read off the teleprompter the entire time, which is, again, rare for Donald Trump to do. It seems no side obviously wants this to become a war. The Iranians, it's said in many articles and many reports, purposefully did not actually kill American soldiers, even though there are Iranian outlets that are claiming that Americans were killed in these attacks. It seems that the Iranians, if we are to believe the Western, at least reports, did not attack U.S. soldiers specifically, but just targeted a few meters or so away from them in order to just send a message. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're joined now by Bamo, Nouri, who is an academic, political analyst, investigative journalist, and expert of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. He's joining us from London. Also joining us from London is Farhang Jahanpour, who is a part-time tutor at the Department of Continuing Education at Kellogg College at the University of Oxford. Farhang and Bamo, thank you both for your time today. Bamo, let me start with you. We seem to be on the brink of war. Have we now completely moved away from it, do you think?
I think initially it was a firm test of waters by Trump to see that this kind of use of soft power over the last 4 or 5 years in Iraq, has it worked? Has it been effective? Because these protests are in demand, and the protesters demanding similar rights to what fits in with the kind of classic Americanism, if you like. So these kind of individual rights to prosper, freedom of speech, basic services, all these things were almost like a refreshing call out, if you like, to those Americanisms. And Trump tested the waters initially with his actions to see, do I have a chance in this country? Again, does America have a chance? Because the result of the 2003 war was, simply put, that Iraq was lost and Iran's influence increased. Over the past 3-4 days, it's been a firm case that Iraq wholly has both rejected any sort of U.S. intervention or the idea of it. Same for Iranian influence, but Iraqi MPs are all in agreement around kind of what the viewpoint is towards America, but they still have the allegiances towards Iran. So I think that initially made Trump kind of think, right, you know what? I've tested the waters. It's not going to work out as planned. So now we're going to kind of try and diet down a little, because nobody ultimately wants a war, especially before November elections. And I think the Iranian regime have helped to quash that as well.
Farhang, would you agree that the Iranians did play quite a risky game here? Right? This could have gone very wrong.
I advocated that they really should respond in a much calmer, long-term and strategic way, rather than just attacking U.S. bases. But the problem is that they also have a domestic audience. And after American activities in Iraq, killing leading Iranian general and a large number of allies, the Qatar, Hezbollah, previously, they had to show some reaction. So I think at least I'm relieved that so far the reaction has been rather measured. It seems they informed, as the Iraqi prime minister said, they had informed him of the attack. It seems that Americans had either been moved away to safe places. So there was some damage done to the base, but there were no casualties. So far, so good, as President Trump said. But I think it is too early to say that the crisis is over.
Okay, so let's talk about Iraq more, Bamo, because I feel like that's an aspect of this that isn't spoken about enough, right? All of this happened on Iraqi territory. And even though, as you correctly there said, the MPs and others have made that decision to tell the U.S., listen, you need to get out. at some point soon. However, and yes, the Iranians have not been told that yet, but all of the above politicians, and we're talking about the Prime Minister, the President, the Parliament Speaker, have condemned the continuing violation of Iraqi sovereignty. That's an important aspect, isn't it?
I think that's the only route that they can go down, because there's a heavy allegiance from Iraq towards Iran. When you look at Iran in Iraq, 2014, the Iraqi army defects. It's all these Iranian guards under Qasem Soleimani who came back to then secure Iraq and its sovereignty and its borders. So in a situation like this, if it turns around and it kind of starts to go against the Iranian regime and Iranian interests, it's going to shoot itself in the foot. So it has to take the one kind of diplomatic path, and that's to kind of go down the road of sovereignty and that we don't want a war, and that's the best way. Otherwise, if they openly kind of condemn either side, then they're burning bridges. And in Iraq, it's very, very difficult to build international bridges, especially since 2003.
Farhang, I wonder what your thoughts are on that. It's like, I don't want to use this term, but it seems like a free-for-all almost when it comes to Iraq right now, where everyone who has a disagreement with the other, especially the U.S. and Iran, are fighting on their territory, as much as they have made it clear, listen, we don't want to have anything to do with this fight. We want good relations with both sides. Keep your fight to yourselves.
I think you're right. I think Iran should be careful not to give the impression of being an uninvited guest like the Americans have been. But I think probably some people, especially the opposition to the government in Iraq and those who are hostile to Iran, are overplaying it. The fact of the matter is that vast majority of the Iraqis are Shiites. Iran does not have a group which is controlled just by Iran. There are Iraqi personnel, Iraqi forces, under command of Iraqi generals, but they seem to receive some Iranian support. It is very much like U.S. allies in the region. So to say that there are unwanted guests or Iran is having excessive influence in Iraq, I think probably is exaggerated, but Iranians should be careful not to give that impression. Iraq is a proud, independent country, does not want to be pushed around either by Iran or by the United States. But given the history of the U.S. involvement in Iraq for the past 30 years or more, from the time that they tried to topple Qasem and supported Saddam, and then the war with Iran, and then the sanctions on the Iraqis killing over 1.5 million people, then the wars. So I really think that there is not a parallel equivalency between Iranians and the Americans. Iranians are talking to their neighbors with lots of religious, historical, ethnic, even family links, while the Americans are 8,000 miles away coming here as uninvited guests and don't want to leave. You should give us billions for the bases that we have built here to ensure our dominance. So I think one has to be careful not to equate the two together. But at the same time, as I said, Iranians should be very careful not to give the impression that they are doing the same kind of thing in Iraq as the Americans are doing.
Okay, so Bamo, one other aspect of which I found interesting is that Vice President of the U.S., Mike Pence, has said that the U.S. received intelligence that Iran has in fact asked the militias that are allied with it and or within its sphere of influence not to attack U.S. targets. Muqtada al-Sadr also seemingly has echoed a similar statement saying, listen, this crisis is now over. Let's all stand down and be patient. Let's wait for the new government to come in Iraq and see then what happens next. However, at the same time, we do have a militia like Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq and Qais al-Khazali, who has posted a statement saying, listen, this is only the Iranian retaliation right now. The Iraqis have not yet retaliated, for example, for the killing of Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. Is there more to come?
I think in a long-term view, 100%, there's going to be a lot more kind of conflict, both cold and warm types of wars. I think it's not going to escalate straight away because you've got on the US side, the elections are coming up, election year, very, very difficult time to pick to start a war, probably the worst thing to do. And then on the Iraqi side, you've got a very, very proud nation who isn't just going to take anything lying down, as they've kind of proved in the last 20 years or so. So it's going to be interesting. It's not the end of the matter as in the end of the end, but it's the kind of end of this current stage of it. That's probably the best way to look at it.
Farhang, I wonder what your thoughts are on that, because Iran, as you said, does have influence and it's a neighbor, all of the above. But do you think that its influence is limited over even what we call these militias? Can it dictate to them and say, listen, we've done what we needed to do to retaliate, so all of you just stand down, and will everyone just automatically give in, do you think?
Yeah, as I said, when you say that they are sort of Iranian allied militia, this gives the impression that they are in charge. But this really is not the case. They are Iraqis with their own agenda, with their own program, and whatever they like to do is their business. But I think it would be better for them and for Iran to play a long game, as they have been doing before. The best option for Iraq, and I believe for the Middle East as a whole, and it's something which President Trump has said, that he wants to withdraw U.S. forces from the region. After decades of carnage, destruction, killing, it is better for the U.S. forces to return and take care of what President Trump, again at the beginning of his term, said, U.S. carnage. There's a lot of work for them to do in the U.S., and I think Iran should not push for violent action, but for action through the Iraqis and through other governments. It's interesting that the Iraqi government said that Soleimani had gone to Baghdad to talk about rapprochement with Saudi Arabia. Yeah. So it is interesting that, they want rapprochement and they should be pushed to get it.
Bamo, another thing which struck me, and I said this in my introduction as well, is how Donald Trump made the statement that he made after the Iranian retaliation took place. Very scripted, as you could tell as well, reading off auto teleprompters, very scripted statement, not usually how Donald Trump would approach such a serious issue, you would imagine. Do you think that behind the scenes he's been under a lot of pressure to actually stand down, even by the U.S. establishment, even though he had made that promise to Iran, listen, if you retaliate, we'll hit you back a lot harder?
I think he's been under great pressure, period. I think the decision, especially in election year, has brought a lot of criticism from his own kind of campaign team. I think the general pressure that he's been under recently as well hasn't helped. And I think because this is a world crisis and US being a leader of the free world, having undertaken this attack without notifying any of the allies, that in itself has brought great pressure from all the allies and just the international community as a whole, which is, in a way, in essence, if you like, helped this take the direction that it has taken for Trump to turn around and say, well, look, we need to it's going to die down there. It's interesting because he is not in a position now to take this in a kind of humorous way or to exaggerate things further. He's got to be very, very careful because every word literally could cost him or escalate the crisis or both.
On that point, I may stay with you, Bamo, because if we just for a moment look within the U.S. and the domestic pressures that Donald Trump has on him, we've had the Russia collusion case and now we have impeachment as well. Do you not think that the argument that some people are making that he was possibly looking to deflect and or distract attention away from impeachment, that is possibly a legitimate argument?
100%, definitely. I think distraction politics is a classic and has always been a classic throughout US history, all the way back to the probably 1780s. With this specific case of Iran, it's an ongoing issue. The world's aware of it. The tensions have been there for over 2 decades quite firmly and before also. So to use this opportunity, and I honestly still would go by the word that it was a test, if you like. Removing Soleimani was an experiment to also see would these Iraqi protesters turn around and up their protest so we could have a potential escalation in Iraq, which would require our services again. It didn't work, so he's going to have to kind of take the other approach. But on a positive side for him, is it has dominated news, it's dominated conversations, and it has probably taken a lot of the edge off for Trump.
Farhang, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there is something interesting about the timing here? Because Soleimani, if we're completely honest, didn't always travel very secretly to Syria and Iraq. I mean, it's said that he was semi-secretive when he would travel. That's the word I've seen used in a couple of reports, where he didn't completely always travel within, the dark of night, etc., especially to a country like Iraq, which, again, is a good ally of Iran also, and especially in this case where he was seemingly on a diplomatic mission to deliver this letter. Why now then? What do you make of the U.S. timing in all this?
And I think what you and Dr. Nouri said about some domestic issues are very, very important. He was under a great deal of pressure. As you know, this week, we should have been talking about impeachment. The war that he launched, the attack that he launched on Soleimani, was without not only consultation, but even informing Congress. Nancy Pelosi is just putting in motion saying that she wants to limit the war power acts of the president to make sure he doesn't go too far. Senator Rand Paul said that the explanation that they had provided the Congress about the reason for this was far from satisfactory. Many others have said this was an insult to Congress. Foreign leaders, allies of America, were never consulted. Britain was not, Germany was not. Apparently the only person who was told was Netanyahu. So I think there's a great deal of domestic issues involved in this. And obviously he wants to create a diversion from his domestic problems, especially impeachment. And also I am not completely in agreement that a war would be bad for him in the lead up. A limited war always brings people together. So as he said about President Obama, watch out, he is going to start a war with Iran just before election because he's very weak. I think this applies more to him because President Trump is in a very difficult position. Impeachment, nothing has gone wrong right for him. All his foreign policy adventures have really failed, whether it's in Syria, whether it is in Iraq, whether it is with North Korea, whether it is with China, whether it was with Venezuela. So there is nothing to show. And so it certainly was a distraction from a whole host of domestic and foreign problems and pressures that he was under. And certainly for this week, now all the talk is about Iran and Soleimani rather than about impeachment.
Bamo, talking about bringing people together, this has brought the Iranian people together who were, just a month or so ago protesting against their government for grievances such as, petrol price hikes or other grievances that they may have. This has in fact brought them together and has rallied them around each other and the establishment there. That sort of completely defeats the U.S. purpose, doesn't it?
It does. I think any sort of U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East has always been undercut by some sort of lack of knowledge or lack of understanding or some sort of ostentatious Orientalism, if you like, when making decisions. So anything that involves countries in this region, you have to understand how nationalistic they are, how proud they are, how cultured they are. This is something that America itself doesn't really understand because it's a fairly new nation, and its culture is its Americanisms. Whereas, if you go back to the Persian Empire, these kind of affections and connections to the motherland are prominent, especially when there's a foreign force as documented and as taught about as the US within Iran. Taking a stance like that, of course, it's going to unify the nation 100%. And I think it's a win on both sides, Waqar. If you're going to look at this situation, you have to always also see that if the Iranian regime don't retaliate and a war doesn't escalate, then Trump is most likely going to use this as some sort of campaign win because Soleimani had committed a lot of different acts that involved the deaths of U.S. soldiers, etc. So it's going to be a win for him. And then for the Iranian regime, it will be also similarly a regrouping attempt.
All right, well, we'll leave it there at that. But of course, appreciate Bamo and Farhang for their time and the context that they provided to this discussion. As I said in my introduction, viewers, it seemed that we were right at the brink of war, didn't it? And everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what Donald Trump would say. He delayed that initial statement, came out then with a very scripted statement, flanked by military officials. It seems that the message behind the scenes to him was stand down. Even though he had given threats to Iran, you dare not retaliate upon the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. Iran has retaliated, though, but has, according to American reports, not killed any U.S. troops or even injured them. But according to Iranian reports, there have been U.S. troops injured and killed. It depends on which side you fall on and believe. But nevertheless, it seems that we've come back from the brink, at least for the moment, when it comes to this sort of conventional in-your-face warfare. That said, now sanctions will be placed on Iran, even harsher sanctions, as Donald Trump has promised. That's not a good thing for Iran, which is already going through economic difficulties. Then, of course, there's a legacy of a man like Qasem Soleimani. Was he simply a man who should be remembered who was fighting against ISIS, or should he be remembered, as the Americans would term him, as a terrorist? That is an argument which also still very much continues. And we'll keep a close eye, of course, on this fluid situation. A lot more certainly in this regard still to come. I'll leave it there for now, though, for this segment. I'll be back with the next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. We're going to sort of continue our first segment, but bridge this more now to domestic U.S. politics. As you well know, there is now an argument growing within the corridors of power within the United States about the war powers that a U.S. president has, and whether Donald Trump has respected the role that Congress should be playing in the likes of assassinating Qasem Soleimani or Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, and whether Donald Trump should have brought in Congress, A, in this decision, and B, whether his powers need to then be reined in that regard. There's also now a dissatisfaction on the part of many lawmakers, even Republicans, two Republicans seemingly, Mike Lee and Rand Paul, about even the justification for this assassination. Them saying that, listen, they weren't shown anything in the briefing that they've had about the justification, or the needed justification at least, for this to have occurred legitimately on the part of the United States. Then there's also, as I put to our guests in the first segment, the issue of impeachment. That's still very much going through, but now Nancy Pelosi is being criticized even by Democrats for holding on to the articles of impeachment and not sending it to the Senate for the trial to finally begin. I bring that up in this regard because, as I put to our first two guests in this show, was Trump looking to distract and deflect from that? Let me put all of those issues to our guests who are joining us now. We're joined by Nicholas Mucerino, who is an independent analyst of international affairs with a focus on the former Soviet Union and the Middle East. He is joining us now from New York. Joining us from Istanbul is Onur Erim, who is the president of Dragoman Strategies. He's a political advisor, author, and has worked at the White House during the Clinton administration. And joining us from New York also is Mark Meirowitz, who is a professor at the State University of New York Maritime College and a political analyst. Mark, Onur, and Nicholas, thank you to all three of you for your time. Mark, let me start with you. Let's start firstly with the powers that a U.S. president has to go ahead and attack, for example, somebody seen as an enemy, such as Qasem Soleimani. Do you think Donald Trump followed the rules here?
Well, it's questionable what the rules are. The Constitution is not very clear. Well, it's clear in a sense. The president is the commander-in-chief, and Congress has the power to declare war. Now, it is true that Congress passed the War Powers Act to rein in the president, but presidents have not agreed that that includes Obama and Bush, including Trump, that they are subject to this law, which requires the president basically to notify Congress within 48 hours of commencing hostilities. So the question here is, and I think Trump gave that report, but the reports that are given are always related to the War Powers Act, but never subject to the War Powers Act, and also to withdraw troops after a certain amount of time if Congress says so. There are a number of executive orders about assassination. There is also the argument about the need for an authorization for the use of military force to have the U.S. involved in Syria and Iraq. All these issues are on the table now in Congress, But at the end of the day, it is unlikely that Congress will be able to pass a law. And I think about this. Even if they pass a law, that's the House and the Senate, it's very unlikely the Senate would do this because of majority Republicans, then the president could veto it. And that would require a 2/3 vote in both houses, and that's absolutely impossible. I want to put this in the backdrop of what's going on in Washington. You mentioned impeachment. Now, do you think that President Trump is interested in listening to the House of Representatives after they've impeached him? I mean, really, he's a politician. They just impeached him. And you know what? They caused that every book in political science in the entire world has to be revised in the next edition to say that there are not 2 presidents who have been impeached, there are 3 presidents who have been impeached. So if you think that Nancy Pelosi has a good standing with the president after doing this, I think, improper procedure, but that's another subject, then at the end of the day, the president has a lot of say.
Onur, what are your thoughts on that? Because from part of the world, certainly, Onur, as you can imagine, as you can appreciate, this is also fascinating a discussion that you have had all these previous U.S. presidents, as Mark there correctly pointed out, the likes of Obama and others, who have not, in fact, followed the War Powers Act. Why then pick on Trump at this time?
Well, first of all, it's fashionable on both sides of the aisle in the Congress. Let's not forget, as there are, of course, almost maybe unanimously Democrats being opposed to Trump's term, or Trump as president, or Trump as the new president after the election. There are also a lot of oppositions on the Republican side as well, or at least a lot of question marks whether or not Trump should be the candidate for the Republicans in 2020. Now, this being said, politics is all about numbers. It's how many votes you get at the end of the day when the election time comes. I think it's becoming more and more apparent that Trump, maybe it's not safe to say he has a good chance to win in 2020, but Trump certainly does seem to have, at least, a better chance today than he did a couple of months ago or 6 months ago, winning the presidential election or re-election again for himself. So, there are oppositions on both sides. How vocal they are is a different story. But I think people are also coming into realization, which is something I pointed out a while ago, if this impeachment does not go through, it will probably power up Trump more in the public eye than anything else. And now, whether he's extending the limits of his power as the president and as the head of the army, technically, or the armed forces of the United States, is a different story. Let's not forget, Trump is going to election having eliminated 2 of who the U.S. calls terrorists. So this is a big issue that he's going to hang on to, it seems like, going into the election. And if the impeachment does not, result from him being removed from the presidential seat, he might possibly have one of the biggest margins in the recent history, winning over his opponent.
Nicholas, what are your thoughts on this? At issue certainly is whether or not this is just partisanship for the sake of partisanship, or do you think that there's genuine concern that a president's powers to carry out hostilities, such as the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis and others, that needs to be reined in, that there needs to be some oversight over that?
Well, Waqar, I would say that it is a combination of both partisanship as well as genuine concern on the part of many Democrats for how this decision was ultimately made to take Qasem Soleimani in particular. You can see, even from the cast of characters that are in the news right now, criticizing his decision on both sides of the aisle, whether it's Rand Paul or Mike Lee of Utah on the Republican side, or Tim Kaine on the Democratic side. All 3 have been frequent critics of presidents relying on the original authorizations for the use of military force against al-Qaeda and Iraq that followed 9/11 and predated the Iraq War. They believe that it gives the president too much room to interpret their justifications for getting involved in the Middle East. You also saw that when the president made the decision to take out Soleimani in particular, they cited the State Department designation of the Iranian Quds Forces and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as a foreign terrorist organization. There is no legal definition behind the FTO. It's a policy decision made by the State Department. As for Nancy Pelosi, when she made this criticism about President Trump and his decision wanting to limit his capacity to go to war with Iran, it is on firm grounds when you see that many of the administration's officials at the Pentagon and the State Department were issuing very confused public statements justifying the imminence was the word that they used when they made the choice to take out Soleimani. And other U.S. news outlets, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Politico, they all suggested, based on their reporting with sources close to the administration, that taking out Soleimani was considered a far-off option on the menu that they generally offer the president in these kind of scenarios. And the president was concerned openly about his potential image when the Iranian PMF forces started protesting inside the U.S. embassy in Baghdad because it invoked scenes of Benghazi and the 1979 siege in Tehran. So Trump acted in a way to support his image. And what Pelosi's concerns are is essentially that we got lucky this time in the sense that the United States was able to take out two of its stated enemies without any sort of massive Iranian retaliation.
On that point, then, if I may come in, Nicholas, I wanted to get your thoughts on that. We got lucky this time because that leads me to my next question now. We really got to the brink here, didn't we, Mark, where everyone was waiting with bated breath to see how Donald Trump would then react to the Iranians attacking those U.S. bases in Iraq. It seemed, at first, as you well know, that his initial statement was delayed. Then the statement that did come out, he was flanked by many U.S. officials, especially military officials, and it was a very scripted statement. Donald Trump just reading off the auto cue the entire time, seemingly. Do you think that he appreciates how close all of this came and that there is actually a need to possibly rein in his powers to carry out such hostilities?
Well, I think this situation was very measured, actually, because if you look at the reaction of the Iranians, the Iranian reaction was very measured, very limited. And then I'm not in favor of it. It violated Iraq's sovereignty. It was a terrible thing that was done by Iran. But the fact of the matter is, Trump he took out Soleimani and the Iranians reacted. This was not a full war. This was not a hostility. There are no hostilities. To go back to the points that were made before, I think it's very important to understand. Number one, yes, this was your question. Is this an institutional challenge? Definitely, because we had the same exact issue in the Obama administration about Syria, where you had a bipartisan effort on the part of the Senate and the House, both parties saying the presidency and the Congress needs to be involved in foreign policy decisions. This is a long-standing issue in American history where the Congress wants to be a player in foreign policy. But as a practical matter, because the founding fathers gave the president the title of commander-in-chief, the president has a lot of leeway. I agree with Onur Bey and his point about what happened with Trump's popularity. I think that the funny part, it's not funny, it's actually fairly bizarre, that the criticism of Trump in terms of taking out a terrorist like Soleimani is coming from the Democrats here in the United States. I don't hear worldwide condemnation. There's a lot of condemnation of it. But even in Iraq, that the parliament, when it met, right, the parliament, there were no Sunnis and no Kurds present, only the Shiites in the Iraqi parliament. There are many people around the world who have said that this is a terrorist, and he was named as a terrorist. And I think that was the point that Nicholas made, and I think it's very important. Okay. If you think about I think they were quite strategic in naming Soleimani and the IRGC as terrorists in anticipation of taking this action. And I think a terrorist like Soleimani, I think that's, to me, in the legal principle, it speaks for itself and his activities. So again,
if I come in, Mark, I totally get your point. Onur, I wanted to just for a moment talk back to impeachment. There has been a comparison made, and I think, Onur, you're the perfect person to ask this, that between how Bill Clinton reacted to his impeachment process as well as how Donald Trump is reacting, and I'm speaking specifically then about war and acts of hostility on other countries. Is this something which is used as a distraction? Do you think at any level that Donald Trump may have thought, listen, this will be the perfect deflection away from impeachment?
Why not? It's a perfect opportunity for a politician. But let's just make 2 points clear. The grounds of impeachment for President Trump and President Clinton are way different, and they would have way different views in the public eye. But let's not forget, this is not something that he started. He just pursued it after. But the whole impeachment process came out with the efforts of mostly on the people on the Democratic aisle. Now, once I guess Trump saw the opportunity to take and run with this, he did, and you can't blame a politician for doing that, no matter how bizarre it would be. And I agree with that point. But it is what it is. This is what politics is about. You make your moves. You wait for the public reaction, and then you take your position according to it. And that's exactly what a politician would do, and that's exactly what Trump has done. So I would blame him for a lot of things, but not for this.
That's interesting, then, Nicholas, because on some level, then someone could say, Americans could turn around and say, you're basically playing with our national security for your own political gain. That's a very dangerous, risky game, isn't it?
Of course, it is a very risky game if the president is using his foreign policy making and national security decision-making powers to support himself domestically in the political realm. That's the whole basis behind the impeachment inquiry into his dealings related to Ukraine. In the case of Iran, it's a bit more of a difficult target for his opponents to really criticize him on it, because Iran is recognized as a leading state sponsor of terrorism, and the cause of opposing them is particularly strong within the Republican Party, and that is why you saw after Soleimani was taken out, them all line up behind the president in a way that was frankly unprecedented in their invocation of patriotism, saying that you cannot oppose the president for taking out a terrorist. That's essentially taking the terrorist side over your own countries. We haven't seen language like this, frankly, since the run-up and aftermath of the Iraq War in the very early years. So among the Democrats, it's very difficult for them to challenge him on this, particularly since it gives them a credential of saying, well, look, I took out al-Baghdadi from ISIS last year, and now I took out Soleimani, and the Middle East is a better place because of it. And as one of my colleagues mentioned, there isn't a lot of pushback even within the region on it. You have some countries criticizing it as an illegal move and overreach, such as Russia. But in general, it's been more of a neutral. Many countries have taken a neutral stance, calling for a calming of tensions, with very few tears lost for Soleimani.
Okay, we'll leave there as a final point. We appreciate all three of our guests, Nicholas, Onur, and Mark, for their time and the insight that they brought to this discussion. Certainly, viewers, this issue, which continuing, we spoke about, of course, from topic one of this show, and that, of course, about the U.S.-Iran tensions, plays very much within U.S. domestic politics. Also, there is this impeachment trial still to take place within the Senate if Nancy Pelosi ever decides to really send those articles of impeachment. But then it seems that there's now a shadow being cast over Donald Trump and whether he should be reined in, his war powers should be reined in specifically at this time. Is he a danger to U.S. national security, or is he actually acting in favor of national security? That seems to be the argument right now, because the briefing that even Republican senators find disturbing and not providing a justification for taking out Soleimani. That's sort of looming over everyone's head too. And within that briefing, seemingly many of these senators and lawmakers were told, listen, don't debate this issue outside. Don't argue with us on this. Just take us on our word that this was justified. Is that how a U.S. president's powers should play out, especially at a time when he's possibly looking for deflection from his impeachment trial? We'll keep a close eye on that, of course, here in Scope. I'll leave it there for now, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.